Welcome everybody to this Merry Musing on time. And the subtitle I gave it was Exploring and Transcending Our Experience of Time as Linear. And this was informed to some extent by my initial inquiry into Bohm and Krishnamurti as we went into last time. But then I felt drawn to go deeper into this question. And so that's what has led to this inquiry today. These were some of the books that I kind of read in context when I was trying to explore what are different perspectives on time. And the left one is really more about the person who discovered linear time, which we'll come to in a bit. And James Gleick's book kind of is quite good, does a bit of an overview of things, and particularly this whole question of time travel and how people are how people see that and try to make sense of it, which is something that we'll come on to at the end. And then Krishnamurti's and David Bohm's inquiry in The Ending of Time, which takes us into the kind of space beyond the linear time, as it were. So now I want to frame this in the context of, let me see if this works, yeah, in the context of the spiral dynamics model, which I can't assume that everybody is familiar with. So just to touch on it briefly, essentially a description of our collective and individual journey through time. Where it starts, and if you take the scheme, the pictures on the left, it starts from a kind of survival through into tribal groupings, into our more feudal empires, nation states, and the traditional religions. Then the kind of market reality, or the industrial world as an expression of the orange one, into a more values-driven kind of world citizen kind of perspective in green, and then into an integral systemic view from yellow, and a more holistic at turquoise. So in terms of our collective journey in the industrialized world, we're probably, around orange-green. But there are communities and there are countries who are also more, let's say, still focused on the blue value system. So when I was looking into this and exploring the different perspectives that I came across, the spiral actually helped to understand why and where these different perspectives came from, and to provide a kind of integrative framework. So that's how this David Bohm quote at the top I thought was really appropriate here. He says, "Time is a theory which everybody adopts for psychological purposes." Time is a theory which everybody adopts for psychological purposes. So if you link that to spiral dynamics, which at an individual level describes our coping mechanisms, the way we as individuals cope with the world around us, then that is very much about our psychological purposes. So one could say, in that sense, time is related to, so as a theory, is not an absolute, is a theory that we take on to help us cope with our reality as we experience it. So I'm going to use this framework to help make sense of the different perspectives on time and the current inquiry where we are in around how and what does it look like if you try to transcend linear time. So in the first two phases, and which you'll notice are marked internal, and the next four external, and then another two internal, that references an idea that the early two value systems, which were precognitive by nature, were focused on the interior sensing as the core perspective of the human being. So rather than it being a more rational a perspective that was focused on the world around it, it was focused on the experience of the world from the interior. And in those cultures, in those times, the experience of time was one of a cyclical nature related to the seasons of the earth. So time was experienced as cyclical. It wasn't experienced as linear with past, present, and future. And we'll come to some evidence for that a bit later. What then happens with the emergence of the sense of separate self, the red value system, the ego that sees itself as separate from the world around it and sees everything as parts separated around it, is that we start to experience reality and time as linear. And that feeds into our agricultural development, where for the first time, rather than just hunter gathering for the moment, we plant seeds to grow things for the future. So the development of agriculture was tied in very much to this development of linear time. And this perspective persists over these four core value systems, which is the reason for which is described more in evolution theory, which I'm not going to go into in detail here. But that is how I've described, let's say, the final two systems in this octave as the time experience being volutionary, where it integrates the linear and the cyclical. So that is, we're going to go into each of these perspectives and look at how they've defined our worldview and reality, and what that means in terms of our experience of time. One other concept to share before we start on that journey is, this is Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants integral theory. And the focus here, as he describes, you have this interior perspective and an exterior perspective. The interior perspective is what goes on under the surface, as it were, that you can't just see by looking at it. Whereas the exterior perspective is an external one, a more inverted commas objective that you can see and measure and things. And this concept of psychological time and chronological time came from the work of Bohm and Krishnamurti, where they were saying, on the one hand, you've got chronological time, which is the evolution, as it were, of time as we see it around us in the world outside, when we study it and look at the fossil records and everything else. Whereas psychological time is our inner experience of that chronological time, of that exterior time, how we relate to it, whether we spend our time in the past or in the future or more in the present, is our inner experience of the time. And so those two concepts are two that we'll see coming back during this journey. So let's start with the pre-rational cyclical time. Now, in Latin language is a good place to look for evidence of how a culture experiences time. And in Western and languages, and English in particular, so I'm just trying to let Jan Jung in here, but so it's hard to get to the button like this. Yeah. The future, in the way that it's defined in our languages, the future lies ahead of us. We talk about the future being ahead of us, and we talk about time and the past being behind us. I should say the past, actually. Future lies ahead of us and past lies behind us. But that's not the same everywhere, which is an important realization, because it means that the way that we assume that time is in terms of its linearity is not a universal. For example, the Aymara speakers in the Andes, they point forward to the past where they can see it, and they point back to the future. And the past is in front of them because they can see it. So their language actually reverses the way we describe it in the West. The Hopis actually have no structure in their language for past and future. It was all ing forms in the present tense. Everything was doing now. There's just no concept of the linearity of past and future in their language. The Australian Aboriginals think of it spatially. They think of time running east to west, for example. So another just different way of engaging with this concept that we call time and often assume to be a universal in terms of linear time. And Mandarin speakers will often use the word above to mean earlier and below to mean next. So again, another spatial way of describing and engaging with time. So the key about this is to remember that linear time as we experience and assume it now is actually quite a recent phenomena. Came out of, you know, the emergence of the agricultural worldview and societal system, and that if you take it in the context of the whole of humanity's journey, you know, we spent 3 million years as hunter-gatherers. So actually most of our journey has been in that cyclical perspective. That linear perspective is actually quite a recent phenomena and is not universal in terms of how people and cultures experience time. So the rational linear time perspective that most of us find ourselves in today and most of our civilizations have adopted. In this perspective, time is linear. It's we talk about the chronological time, as I referred to before. It's focused on the exterior reality with cause and effect. Okay, something happens now, that influences something else that happens next. That in this world, matter falls apart once something is created. It falls apart with randomness, which in this perspective, in this definition of entropy, the example being that if you put a mug into the sea twice, it's highly improbable that you'll get the same water. So that randomness, this kind of concept of randomness, things dispersing and falling apart in a kind of random way. So there not being an interconnected pattern, as it were, behind it. And in this worldview, the focus is very much on the outer world and on the parts through the use of the rational mind as the dominant way of knowing, and for many on the planet, almost the only accepted way of knowing. So our experience of time and this idea of the past is actually linked to our exterior focus on matter, on things that were around us, and the role of light, which is interesting. Here's John Banville quoted in Gleick's book. Even here at this table, the light that is the image of my eyes takes time, a tiny time, infinitesimal, yet time to reach your eyes, So the light that's the image of my eyes takes time to reach your eyes. And so it's everywhere we look, everywhere we are looking into the past. And the extreme, of course, is, you know, the light that comes from the stars. When we look at the light coming, we're seeing the star from a long time ago because of the time it takes for the light to reach us. So our almost sole focus on the world of matter around us, around the exterior, on the exterior world around us, links us to this function of light, and therefore ties us to a linear perspective on time, because the whole time we are effectively observing the past. We frame time as something that's independent to us in our language, as an object. Time flies, it flows, it's a third person object that is something that just happens around or to us from this perspective. As Wittgenstein says, to say time passes more quickly or that time flows is to imagine something flowing, right? So some external thing flowing. Again, it's perceived as a function of this exterior world around us without any relationship to our interior reality. And this was Krishnamurti's gripe with our current psychological time, so the way of relating to that time. And he said, I want to abolish time psychologically. It's the cause of man's confusion, introducing time as a means of becoming, and becoming more and more perfect, more and more involved, more and more loving. Even that, the point is that you are caught in a linear time perspective where you never arrive at the destination. You're never just being, you're continually in this becoming. So that means you're continually not present to the moment. You're continually caught up in the future that isn't here yet, or the past that isn't here anymore. And his passion was to resolve human suffering in its most fundamental level. We have to, in his language here, abolish this psychological time and enable people to be far more present actually with what is. It's a quote from the Gleich book. Without, and this relates also to Bohm, Krishnamurti's stuff on thought, which we'll be looking at next time. Without sequential time, thought, a process, is hard to imagine. Right? Without sequential time, thought is hard to imagine because it's a process, right? Consciousness requires time, it seems. It requires being in time. When we think, we seem to think consecutively, one thought leading to another, in timely fashion, forming memories all the time. A God outside of time would not have memories. Omniscience doesn't require them. So there's another framing around how linear time and rational thought are intrinsically tied to each other, which was another core point that Bohm and Krishnamurti were making. Okay. So what would it look like if we were to transcend, yet include these two perspectives in what I call volutionary time, where we are accessing information fields that aren't purely visible to our normal senses, let's say, or our exterior focused senses. To be able to access this world, we have to access it through our interior. So you'll notice again that on the spiral graphic, the words have shifted again to internal. So our foundational perspective is an internal one, where we are more focused on our sensing of the reality, our perspective of it, rather than losing ourselves solely in the world around us. And in this reality, it's not as linear. There is not this cause and effect that we see in the material world around us, and this backed up by much research and of course by all the quantum work that's been done recently, and the Princeton research into the power of your intention and how all of that can operate outside of time and space, actually. And the perspective isn't new, in the sense that way back in the early 1900s, we had this Einstein-Minkowski space-time, where they were reflecting on how the past and the future seem to be linked. It seemed like they see here this past light cone and a future light cone, that there's like some kind of relationship between the past and the future. And it reflects when in evolution theory, when I look at the octave of the spiral based on the dance research that we did with Dylan Newcomb, you can see how the bottom four systems reflect the top four systems. So orange is a reflection of blue, green of red, yellow of purple, and turquoise of beige, but just at a higher frequency, you could say. But it's interesting here they use the term geometrically identical, because that's how the dancers experienced it as well. They said the basic form of blue and orange was the same, but the energy or the movement or the subtlety of it was greater in orange, let's say, or the same with the red and green. So they were pointing from more of a physics perspective, some kind of relationship between the past and future. Einstein quote, "People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." So someone, again, who was ahead of his time, trying to frame things in a new way, but just interesting to see how long it takes for new ideas to permeate through a collective. In 1941, at Princeton, Johnny Wheeler and Dick Feynman presented an idea to Einstein where they were saying that particles must be exerting their influence on other particles, not only forward in time, but also backward in time, again, symmetrically. So that the impact of the particle on the future and the past had a relationship, direct relationship at the same time. So it's like, I often use the image of the, the tree with its branches and roots, that as the branches are growing up, so the roots are growing down, and that it's going on in parallel. And that is so there's something happening that isn't as linear as we think it is in our normal perspective. So George Steiner said it, interestingly, it's not the past which rules us. So that you could say that's the chronological. It's the image of the past. So the psychological. So it's not that physical past that influences us. It's how we choose to relate to that past. That is what influences us. Do we spend our time thinking about it, worrying about it? Then that, of course, is what rules us. Then we're defined by our past, or are we able to somehow free ourselves from that past and be more in the present? The Krishnamurti quote, "For the brain to deny time is a tremendous activity of having no problems. For any problems that arise, any question is immediately solved." Right? The moment that you are living outside of time, as it were, in the present, and you have a question, you immediately get the download or the insight that resolves it, because there's not a tension between having to do something in order to be able to solve it at a future in a linear time perspective, because you're outside of a linear time perspective. But that, as he says, requires tremendous activity. To get to the point of being able to do that requires quite some work. Another one, "God can only operate if the brain is quiet, if the brain is not caught in time." So not busy with thinking about the past or thinking about the future. A nice one from Joseph Campbell. "Eternity isn't a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. The experience of eternity right here and now is the function of life." So again, he's pointing to this non-linear experience. And a lot of his work, of course, was with traditional perspectives and the myths and things. So he may be also pulling on the pre-rational, beige, purple perspectives and experience of time. And this is something that both I've heard, picked up in the Bohm Krishnamurti work, but also in how you hear the physicists talk about the smallest particles and things in our reality, is that it's the present. Reality is constantly refreshing itself in the present, so it's always the present. And then this was the image I got. It's like pressing the refresh button on your browser the whole time. It's continually refreshing itself, but you're still in the present. And the physicists talk about these particles that keep popping up of potential and then disappear into the field, and then depending on which ones are captured in that moment through our attention is what informs what becomes the material world and shifts things into this linear perspective. So there's a continual refresh going on in every moment. That was an image that kind of really helped me to, I think, grasp what they've been pointing to. Okay. So in this research, this was something I came across, what they called the arrow of time dilemma, or Loschmidt's paradox. The image on the left, you'll notice is the spiral image, but he takes it back biologically into earlier aspects of the organism. But the thing is, and this is what pushed me into the evolution theory research, is it's still an evolutionary arrow. The perspective of development, as we often see it described in Ken Wilber's work, for example, is still very much about moving from one stage to the next stage to the next stage to the next stage. Even if you include involution, which is about things coming out of the subtle and into the material, that's still described as like it's two linear processes now. And my hunch was in the evolution research that it isn't, one, it's not linear, and two, it's not two processes. It's one thing going on at the same time, and it's far less linear and looks a lot more like a toroidal form than an evolutionary ladder. So this was the dilemma that I still haven't seen being resolved. To the physicist, says Gleich, it feels that a troublesome gap lies between the microscopic laws at the quantum level, where time has no preferred direction because the laws are reversible, and the macroscopic world, so the visible world, the material world that we can see around us, where the arrow of time points from the past to the future. This gap is a disconnect, a lapse in explanation, says Gleich. Yeah, so the microscopic is the quantum. And if you think of that, just the octave of 8 that I had on the other slides, and just see that as a core pattern, and just forget about the particular cultural side of it, that the first two you could think of as like the quantum, the smallest level of reality, and the top two being the consciousness that actually enables us to engage with that reality. So the beige and purple are related to the yellow and turquoise. So the quantum dimension from a physics perspective is related to the consciousness dimension in this from the subtle perspective, is my kind of thesis. So which is why you see the same kind of features being described in parapsychology research as in the quantum research. And the macroscopic is focused then on those central 4 external value systems. So they both coexist, right? And so that's how we reconcile this so-called dilemma or paradox, because the micro and the macro both exist. They just exist in different dimensions of reality. So in my original spiral graphic, the micro exists in the internal and the macro exists in the external. So when you're in the external, the laws of the macroscopic world apply, of the laws of thermodynamics, relativity, all of these kind of things apply in the macroscopic world. But once you get into the internal world, different laws apply. It's not linear. It doesn't have this cause effect dimension to it. So when you can see it in that perspective, then it's not, doesn't have to be an either or, and they don't have to be in paradox or contradiction to each other. They can coexist when we understand that they coexist, but one is in the visible, one in the world of visible matter, the macroscopic laws apply, but in the world of invisible quantum reality and subtle information fields, the microscopic laws apply. And that it's all one spectrum of information, essentially, but once it kind of clicks in to the material world and manifests, then the macroscopic laws apply. So I thought that was a nice little one. So what does it mean then, this coexistence of linear and nonlinear? And here are a few other, again, this isn't a new idea, but I think putting it in the context of our collective story here through the spiral does give it a new tint. For example, in the Maitri Upanishad, there are two forms of Brahman, time and the timeless. Okay, yeah, we can deal with that. From the Bible, the Corinthians, for things which are seen are temporal, in time. But things which are not seen, the invisible world, are eternal, i.e. outside of linear time. External, extemporal, eternal, right? So the distinction that we're able to make then when we can see it in the context of our human journey is that we can distinguish between the pre and the post-rational non-linearity, where the beige purple was a pre-rational direct experience of non-linearity. Post-rational integrates the linear, but still but it goes back to having its foundation, as it were, in the felt sense of interconnectedness of things. Thought this was a nice quote from Virginia Woolf. What more terrifying revelation can there be than that it is the present moment? That we survive the shock at all is only possible because the past shelters us on one side and the future on another. And for any of you who have had these moments where you kind of get that realization of that the present is all there is, and everything becomes like completely still, and because the rational mind starts to panic, and it's like, whoa, what's going on here? And seeks shelter, starts to grab something from the past or grab something for the future or locate us somehow in linear time. Because that's the way we've coped for a long time with our reality, is through that linear time perspective. And as Wolf says, that's given us safety. And so it's quite terrifying when we realize that there is only the present moment, terrifying to the ego, of course, and our sense of separation. So I thought it was worth diving into this question of time travel as well. So apparently for Einstein's 70th birthday, his friend Kurt Gödel presented him with a surprising calculation that Einstein's field equations of general relativity allow for the possibility of universes in which time is cyclical, or universes in which some world lines loop back upon themselves, and they called them closed time-like curves, CTCs. A closed time-like curve loops back on itself and thus defies ordinary notions of cause and effect. Events are their own cause. Now, that's starting to sound interesting. And it reflects this image that comes out of the work of eco-intention, which is a practice that works with the subtle information fields of large-scale systems. And Hans Sonderweg, who developed that, draws it this way, in the sense that you've got the blue triangle is the triangle of manifestation of the exterior world that impacts the information field in the red, as it were, the invisible world. And that comes back around and informs the possibilities and probabilities of something manifesting. So that in that sense, the past and the future are interconnected. And one of the things I go into in Volution, and I talked about in the Pain and the Promise talk, is how in order for us to be able to take a next step in our evolution or our volution, we have to reach back often and unlock some energy that has been trapped in the past through a trauma. So again, the image of sending the branches taller, having to send the roots deeper at the same time. So this is sounding a lot like closed time-like curves in Kurt Gödel's language. Now, the objection that people have had to Gödel is that, well, that would mean the universe itself would be rotating, something for which astronomers have found no evidence. And by Gödel's calculation, a CTC, a closed time-like curve, would have to be extremely large, billions of light years, but people seldom mention these details, says Gleich, as he looks to kind of qualify Gödel's perspective here. So what's going on here? Well, that objection, if you think about it, comes from a perspective on the material dimension, on the chronological, on the linear, on the relative world. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to assess and judge the accuracy of a perspective from the non-linear internal perspective using the external linear lens. And of course, that doesn't work. Look at that point. Astronomers, what do astronomers do? They don't look inside, they look outside. And it doesn't fit with time, billions of light years. Well, time doesn't exist in the same way at from the internal perspective. And what Gödel was picking up on was the system as a whole, which is in fact rotating like a torus, right? Like this. And so he was seeing the system as a whole. When you integrate in the evolutionary translinear perspective of the system, it starts to operate more like a torus than a linear evolutionary ladder. So when you're only looking at it through the material lens, you can't see what Gödel is pointing to, and therefore it doesn't fit, and you discard it as being irrelevant, essentially, because you're only looking through the external perspective. So again, we get to integrate these perspectives. And this is Hawking on this, Stephen Hawking. Scientists working in this field have to disguise their real interest by using technical terms like closed time-like curves that are code for time travel. Okay, Professor Hawking, and what do you think about it all? Well, it seems there is a chronology protection agency which prevents the appearance of closed time-like curves and so makes the universe safe for historians. So Hawking is kind of going, oh no, this can't be true what Gödel is saying, because what happens to history then, right? Again, trying to judge something that is a description of the non-linear through a linear lens. And so what does he do? He bans it. He says, oh, it's just impossible. There's a chronology protection agency that prevents this kind of stuff happening, and therefore historians can rest assured. Well, true in the kind of central four systems, as it were, the external focused, linear, rational perspective, but not true in the internal perspectives, where we are actually able to transcend linear time, and where closed time-like curves do in fact operate in that way. So again, a classic, Hawking, a classic, proponent of the material perspective. So here's another one that's often used in a typical way to kind of argue against time travel. What happens if you go back and kill your grandfather? Right, which kind of short circuits the rational mind, because also if you'd done that, you wouldn't exist. So you just can't. So it's like a completely inadequate question, as it were. But what again is happening is it's trying to take the non-linear time perspective and force it into the linear world of matter, because this idea of time travel, and again, that has almost too much of a linearity in it as a concept, because when you travel, you go from one place to another through space that requires time. But the fact that future and past can be interconnected is part of this non-linear time perspective that can't be judged by linear parameters and works in these subtle information quantum dimensions. And some examples of these are Princeton, for example, the work they did on remote perception, where they would have somebody who's going to go to a location and look at a scene, and you have somebody who's trying to pick up what that person is seeing. Okay, so they tried this, hundreds of these experiments, but they tried them also outside of time, where, for example, the person who is trying to pick up the information about what the viewer is seeing does that before the person actually goes to look at the object. They don't know what they're going to look at. They have no idea. All they've got is the person's name, and they know that at some point in time, that person is going to look at a certain object, and then they have to try to pick it up and describe it by drawing or writing or talking or whatever. And they did this numerous times, and the hits were clear. I mean, there was, just from a statistical point of view, the descriptions that people gave of what somebody was going to be seeing in the future were remarkably accurate from what the person was actually seeing. So what's going, so that is working with information fields that operate outside of the physical material world. So from our perspective, it makes sense that you can do that because it's outside of linear time. Likewise, there was an experiment done where they had recorded on tapes phases of like really nice classical music, and then the same time length of white noise that was really disturbing, and then with the classical music again, then the white noise, and they did segments like that. And they took the initial recording and they locked it in a safe, and the copies they then gave out to all sorts of people and said, okay, we want you to listen to this, and as you're listening to them, we want you to concentrate on making the nice music longer and the horrible music shorter, horrible sound shorter. So they did this, and they at the end of the experiment, what they did, they pulled the tape out of the safe and they listened to it, and the nice music had got longer and the horrible music had got shorter. Now that doesn't fit our primarily Western understanding of time and space. But when you put it in the context of the non-linear, the translinear perspective, then of course it can, because you're working at the subtle information field level. In the eco-intention practice, one of the exercises we do is we learn to read the energy fields of trees. And there are three kind of main layers of it, of the trees, that you can really physically feel with your hands or walk into them with your bodies when you're tuning into it. And you do it intersubjectively, so you end up kind of checking, you see that everybody's feeling the same, how far out these fields are, a little like the aura of trees, as it were. And what you can do is you can send a healing to a tree at a distance. So if you've got a photo of this tree, you kind of all tune into it, you send a healing. And one of the things we did was that we sent a healing into the future. So we sent this healing, so let's say we were in the morning and we sent it for a time in the afternoon. And then at that time in the afternoon, we went out and we stood around this tree just before it was meant to arrive, the healing. And we're tuning into the, feeling where the aura was of this tree. And you're standing there. And I tell you, the moment it came in, everybody at the same time kind of was almost pushed backwards. This whole circle of people standing around this tree was expanded backwards as the aura of the tree grew under influence of the healing. So another example of how when you're working outside of the material world, but in the subtle informational realms, you know, the linear time rules don't apply. Likewise, when you're tuning into things, you can try this. If you can go back to a moment in time, and you can kind of get the embodied experience of what it felt like to be there at that time. You get all sorts of images and things like that. You know, many experiments in that area. So then the kind of thing is, oh, but when you're doing this remote perception, then somebody from the, you know, is seeing something somebody's only going to do in the future, are you putting effect before cause? So we saying like, okay, but how can you do this? Because the cause hasn't happened yet. The person hasn't looked at the scene yet. So the effect of somebody else picking it up, that can't work. Well, of course, in the nonlinear reality, there is no cause and effect. So that criticism or that question is an inadequate question again, because it's coming from the rational linear perspective. So this is how you transcend the dichotomies and the tensions that often exist between these worlds by acknowledging that there are these two different dimensions of reality, and the rules are different in those different dimensions. So as a kind of last thought, rather than thinking of us traveling through time, think of us bringing time to us. So rather than us moving into the future or moving into the past, what we're doing is we're coming into resonance with a inverted commas future scenario or past scenario, bringing it to us. It's like I've talked before about us, not us moving through space-time, but space-time moving through us. Okay, so now my bar at the top here is in the way of what I want to say. One sec here. Yeah, so if it's about our psychological relationship, right, to physical and chronological time, if this is what it's about, right, this relationship between, okay, this time and this how we experience it. And these are just questions that I'm going to leave us with. What comes first? Our perception of time, or time itself, or the exterior phenomenon of time? Can we even separate them? Or do they co-evolve as in the four quadrants? Was time, if you think about it, was time actually different? Was time actually cyclical in the pre-rational? Or was it linear and we just had a less developed experience of chronological time and could only experience it as cyclical? Or was it actually cyclical? And are we only measuring things now by chronological time and referencing everything back to chronological time, linear time, because it's our current center of gravity in terms of where we are developmentally? Or shouldn't time, this may be where I end up, better be defined in the relationship between the interior and the exterior? Should time be defined in the relationship between the interior and the exterior? That is how we come to a definition of time. And in that sense, it also can change as our interior experience and the exterior co-volute